Speak, O Lord, as we come to you to receive the food of your holy word.
Hey everyone, I want to welcome you to our program. So glad that you're on here. We're going to pick up our reading right in Galatians chapter 4. We finished chapter 3 last time, and we're going to pick up in Galatians chapter 4. Today we're going to cover more than half of the chapter because I think it's a better cutoff point. Plus tomorrow we will not have a reading. I'm going to be taking my wife to one of her appointments, and I won't be here to be able to do that. But Lord willing, next week we'll pick up right there in verse 21 and we'll continue to read. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Let's go ahead and start our reading. We're going to be there in Galatians 4, and we're going to pick up there in verse 1. He says, let me pull up the verses here. I made them a little bit bigger on the screen. I'm hoping you'll be able to see them a little bit better. So Galatians 4, verse 1, he says, "Now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, does not differ at all from a slave, though he is a master of all, but is under guardians and stewards until the time appointed by the Father. Even so when we were children, we were in bondage under the elements of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying out, 'Abba, Father.' Therefore, you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir of God through Christ. But then indeed, when you did not know God, you served those which by nature are not God's. But now after you have known God, or rather have been known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements, to which you desire again to be in bondage? You observe days, months, and seasons, and years, and I am afraid for you, lest I labored for you in vain. Brethren, I urge you to become like me, for I became like you. You have not injured me at all. You know that because of the physical infirmities, I preached the gospel to you at the first. And my trial, which was in my flesh, you did not despise or reject. But you received me as an angel of God, even as Christ Jesus." In verse 15, he says, What then was the blessings you enjoyed? For I bear you witness that if possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. Have I therefore became your enemy because I tell you the truth? Then they zealously court you, but for no good. Yes, they want to exclude you, that you may be zealous for them. But it is good to be zealous in a good thing always, and not only when I am present with you. My little children, for whom I labored in birth again until Christ is formed in you. I would like to be present with you now and to change my tone, for I have doubts about you. And so we've looked at these first 20 verses. Let's go ahead and start where we began our reading, right there in verse 1. And let's talk about some of the things that we just read. Look at verse 1. He says, even when a child is an heir, how are they treated? Any different than a slave? You know, ever thought, even though that they are the master of all the slaves? Isn't that true? Like, let's just say Bill Gates has a 2-year-old, and Bill Gates writes up his will, and this child gets everything. What would happen even though he is the heir? He would be under guardians and stewards until he's old enough to be able to handle the inheritance of his own. And that's probably some age that would be set by his father. But look at verse 3. He says, even so when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. Isn't that true? Like before we became Christians, before we became sons of God, we're under or in something. We're in some world religions, maybe Catholicism or denominationalism, or in their case, paganism. They're in sin, they're in bondage, lust, weakness, wickedness, and all those kinds of things. And all of us were under something before we became Christians. We all were. And in their case, Jews and Gentiles. If they were under Judaism, if they were under paganism, they were both bondage. One was greater than the other, but both were elementary. Both were elements of the world. Both were elements of the law. One was elements of the law. So notice in the next section, in verses 4 through 7, he's fullness of time had come. So when was that? He's saying that when the time was right, God had a purpose, he had a plan, but he had to wait until the perfect time came. And think back to like Daniel chapter 2, that picture of the statue with the different elements. You had the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, you had Greece, Rome, and then you had God's kingdom, the church. And so under the Roman Empire was the time in which God's church would be established, in which the time of the Messiah would come. And so you think about it, there was a lot of benefits to the Roman Empire for the gospel. You had Roman peace at the time. You had highway systems. You had the common Greek language. We don't know the reason why God chose the time that he did, but God does. And it was the perfect time for God to bring the gospel into the world, and to bring Christ, and to fulfill the promise that he gave to Abraham when all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And so at the perfect time, God sent forth his son. And notice a couple things said about him. Number one, he was born of a woman. He was human. He was made just like us in every way. This was a fulfillment of Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. He was the seed of woman. He was born of a woman in a very special way, unlike anybody else. He was born of a woman solely, period, that's it, just born of a woman. And notice something else that he says. He was born under law. Now, when Jesus was born, what did he live under? He lived under the law. He was born under the law. He lived under the law. And when did the gospel come into an effect? It came into effect when he died. And so when he was still living, he lived as a man under the law. Sacrifices were made, circumcision was obeyed, temple tax was required, Sabbath and the other feast days, they were observed. He fully took on all that it was to live as a Jewish man living under the law. But notice verse 5. This is an important verse, especially as we're talking with people who believe we're supposed to be following the Old Testament. Why was he born under the law? Notice it says to redeem those under the law, so that they could have the adoption of sons. As we saw earlier, that's by faith and baptism into Christ. And so pay attention to the pattern here. God sent his son, born under the law, to redeem those under the law so that we could be sons. Son, law, sons. And so what God did with Christ very much corresponds to what he did for us. And so notice verse 6, because we are sons, God has sent forth his Spirit of his Son into our hearts. Now, he could be talking about the Holy Spirit, but I think he's more talking about the character of his Son. He made us sons like Jesus, that we love God, that we have a reliance upon him, that we have a desire to serve, that we have a desire to live according to his will, a closeness to the Father, a special relationship. It's a remarkable thing that God adopted us as his sons, as his children. And notice he says that we cry out to him, Abba, Father. Abba is Aramaic for father, just an emphasis of closeness. God did everything that he could to make sure that we become his sons, and he adopted us, meaning that he wanted us. It wasn't by accident. And our cry out to him is the fact that we want him. Notice verse 7. What's the difference between the slave relationship and a son relationship? Well, love, closeness, a desire to serve, not just an obligation like a slave would have, but as Paul points out, also an inheritance. We're heirs of God's promise. So notice in the next section, in verses 8 to 11, when they did not know God, what were they doing? Well, they were idolaters. They were slaves to these idols, the figments of their imagination. But now that they know God and that they are known by God, what do they go back to? Why would they return to bondage all over again after they'd been set free? Doesn't make any sense. When they didn't know God, it made some sense. But now that they know God, it makes no sense whatsoever. And notice what he says. How is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements to which you desire again to be in bondage? Notice what he calls Judaism or the law. Weak. He calls them beggarly elements. He calls them bondage. Judaism is another form of bondage. It's something that keeps people from Christ. They're worshiping themselves and the law, not the Lord. They're worshiping the days, months, seasons, and the years, as he talks about in the next verse. And so Paul cares for them, and his fear is that he's labored for them in vain. And they came out of paganism, but now they're going right back to another form of bondage, the law, Judaism. And notice all the law has to offer is enslavement and condemnation. They're weak and powerless. They can't save anybody. And so he's like, why do you desire to even go back to them? So look at the next section in verses 12 to 16. Paul says he came to become just like them. How so? Well, he sacrificed Judaism. He identified himself as a Gentile. He abandoned Judaism to live like a Gentile. And it didn't make any sense for them to go back to what Paul had abandoned. He left Judaism for Jesus. Now they're abandoning Jesus for Judaism. That doesn't make any sense. And so they didn't do any personal harm to him. This is not personal. It's not a personal attack. But in verse 13, why did Paul preach to these people the gospel in the very first place? Because of infirmity. I have no idea what that means. It could mean that he was sick, and because of that, he had to stop in the region of Galilee, and he ended up preaching to them. Could have been that he was seeking treatments there. Could have been that he had been stoned in Lystra, and because of that, he had to stay in that area and started preaching the gospel. He preached everywhere that he went. I have no idea. But he says they could have looked down upon him and not received the message, rejected it. They could have said, am I supposed to follow this sick man? Of course not. And then shunned him. But they didn't do that. Instead, they received him. He says they received him, verse 14, as an angel of God, like God's messenger, or even as Christ himself. And in doing so, they enjoyed great blessings. He's just saying, don't you remember the blessings that you were enjoyed there in verse 15? Because you received the message of Christ? And so in verse 15, he says they did so with great fervency. In fact, he says, you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me if you thought that was necessary. Now, some get confused. They think that this, Paul's infirmity that he mentioned earlier had something to do with his eyes. I mean, that could be something, but that's more of an assumption than it is an educated statement. But Paul's point is, if they thought it needed to be done, they would have done it. They would have given him their most prized and precious possessions. So notice verse 16. Paul tells them the truth, and they went from receiving him as an angel of God, as a messenger of God, and even receiving him as Jesus himself, to being their enemy, all because he tells them the truth? Doesn't make any sense. So look at the last section in verses 17 through 20. And all of this, all of their rejection, simply because of these false teachers who were zealously seeking after them, but not for their good, but for their own good. They wanted the Galatians to be their disciples and to honor them and be their, and to follow them. It wasn't about the souls of these Galatians at all. It wasn't wrong for somebody to take an interest in the Galatians. It wasn't like Paul was trying to heap them up for himself, and he's jealous because of these false teachers, but their motives were not good. And so in verses 19 to 20, Paul's having to experience these labor pains all over again. He had to do that when he first taught them the gospel. Now he's having to do it all over again because of these false teachers. And he's going to do that until Jesus is formed in them, just like Jesus was formed in him. Galatians 2, verse 20. It's no longer I who lives, but Christ who lives in me. He wanted that to happen for them. And so Paul wishes he could be there with them, that maybe it would come across better. That's hard to express care, concern, and frustration all in one letter. He's fearful that it's coming off as sharp and harsh, and he would like to speak lovingly and positively to them, and he's greatly concerned for them, though. And so this letter only expresses that great concern, that great love for them. And there's so much we could take from this, so much of a benefit for us to go through this letter. Sorry, I guess I was behind on the verses, but so much to benefit from reading this letter and just taking in some of the things that Paul's saying. And we're going to pick up again next week. We won't be able to go to it this week. Tomorrow, I have an appointment early in the morning. So Lord willing, next Tuesday, we'll be able to pick right back up here in verse 21. And we'll look at the section about the two covenants that Paul really makes a great argument just kind of a complicated one for us to be able to examine and look at. So appreciate your time, appreciate your attention. And I encourage you, don't just put this down and put it away, but instead really be thinking about this, thinking about what Paul's saying. Read this on your own, study it for yourself, meditate on it, really just ruminate on it. I encourage you to do that. Sometimes we kind of put things away and then we forget all about it. And I don't want that to happen. So appreciate your time, appreciate your attention. Hope you have a great rest of your weekend. Lord willing, I'll be back on Friday. We'll go through Psalm 136, I believe, and we'll pick up and study that. But appreciate your time. Appreciate you. Have a great day. God bless.